Okay, here we are, February 25th, 2021. Tonight is, as a matter of fact, the Jewish festival of Purim started about 20 minutes ago when the sun went down. So we're right now, all over the world, Jews all over the world are celebrating the Feast of Purim. And the Feast of Purim is related to a series of events that occurred in the Book of Esther. And so we'll look at Matthew chapters 14 and 15, which we're regularly scheduled for tonight. We'll look at those next week unless the rapture happens first. But we'll have a special teaching tonight on the Book of Esther and the Feast of Purim. And so the Feast of Purim, again, started at sundown tonight, and will be celebrated today and tomorrow for the Jews all over the world. And so, Steve, I'm going to have you go ahead and open us up in a word of prayer, and then we'll jump right into the special teaching on Purim and how that relates to and is a type of the arrival of Christ to be a sacrifice for the human race, and the arrival of the Antichrist to try to destroy, first off, the Jews, and then secondarily the rest of the human race. So Steve, open us up in prayer, and we'll jump into that special teaching.
All right. Lord God, we thank you again for another Thursday night, for those of the church who are able to tune in, Lord, that would be, that would be taught, Lord, I guess the shadow that Purim, the festival of Purim, presents for us all, Lord, your coming, and also the coming of the Antichrist, which will be, just right on its heels, on the heels of your return. Lord, thank you for, Herb's preparation once again, and thank you again for the word. Thank you for the opportunity for the church to gather here together tonight, and thank you most for your Son, Jesus Christ. In his name we pray. Amen.
All right, now the term Purim, which is plural for pur is the Hebrew word for what we would call today, like dice. The Feast of Purim, it's the rolling of the dice, the lots. It's also known as the Feast of Lots, which was a type of sort of dice. I don't know if you've ever seen during the Feast of Passover. If you ever go to a Jewish Seder, you'll see sometimes there'll be the dreidel will be a little spinning top thing with Hebrew letters on it or whatever. That kind of derives out of the series of events that occurred in the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther occurs in our timeline chart right about here at the end of the Babylonian captivity. And it's interesting because we're talking about Daniel and the prophecies of the book of Daniel and how it relates to Antichrist on our Saturday South Beach Saturday sermon series. So those two end up going together. So take a look at what we did last Saturday, which is up on YouTube at South Beach Gospel Ministries. And for those of you that haven't subscribed yet, please become a subscriber. We've gotten several new subscribers since last week. When we get enough, we can broadcast live for free from South Beach, as opposed to tape delay, which we're using now. But yeah, Purim and Lot, same thing. It's like rolling the dice. And that is a tradition or a festival that has arisen out of the very interesting events of the Book of Esther. Book of Esther, parenthetically, interestingly enough, just to give you some historical side pieces, Book of Esther is, I believe, the only book in the Bible that doesn't make reference to the name of God, but it clearly is implying the presence of God throughout. Maybe it's a type of the Lord having not appeared in human flesh yet, which was eventually fulfilled at the first advent of Jesus Christ, who was not only the Messiah, but was also God in human flesh. So that may be a typology, but we see a couple of other very important typologies in the Book of Esther. In the Book of Esther, we have the story of a Persian king. And again, we were talking on Saturday about the prophecies of the book of Daniel, and how Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, were very important people, and how Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had a dream, and he had this dream of a metallic man, and the metallic man is depicted here. So again, Saturday, we're going to look at this in more detail. We had part 1 last Saturday, and part 2 will be coming up this Saturday. And, you know, Daniel was able to interpret a dream for the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar went into Israel, destroyed the temple, and took everybody that they didn't kill. They killed all the men and took the women and children captive in Babylon for 70 years. Why? Because God wanted the land to enjoy her 70 years rest. During the Babylonian captivity, King Nebuchadnezzar was caused by God to have a dream which he couldn't remember, which disturbed him. So Daniel was supernaturally revealed by God what this dream was all about. And the dream was of a metallic man. And King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Daniel said, you dreamed of a metallic man whose head of gold, chest of silver, hips of brass, legs of iron, feet of iron and miry clay. And we talked about how the iron and clay of the earth is a type of the Nephilim army of the Antichrist during the last days. And goodness forbid, it's not like I'm intentionally trying to drag Bible prophecy, my favorite topic in the Bible, into every teaching, but it just seems to be pronouncing itself. It may be that the Holy Spirit is revealing certain things to me to reveal to you guys, because we are at the very end of the end of the end, and the rapture is about to occur. And the Lord wants us to see these things coming and warn the people that might be left behind if they don't get saved before the rapture. The Antichrist is coming. When he comes, he isn't going to be a good guy. So, again, getting back to what we had talked about our South Beach Saturday series on Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel revealed to Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, you, O king, are the head of gold. And the other successive metallic portions of this man are kingdoms inferior to you. So gold is the most valuable metal on earth, but the second most valuable is silver. And it's the silver that we're looking at today in the Book of Esther. After King Nebuchadnezzar stepped down from the throne, or retired, got old and died, he allowed the Jews to go back into their land to reoccupy the Holy Land of Israel after the 70 years were completed, which fulfilled the prophecy of the 70 years. But after he was replaced, his grandson Belteshazzar was the person who saw the handwriting on the wall. He's the guy that threw a party, and during a drunken, orgy, feast in the palace, he said, "Go get all the the implements that my father Nebuchadnezzar seized from the temple in Jerusalem," and he used them as party favors and implements, mocking the God of Israel. And so God put the handwriting on the walls at Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, which was, it actually was in, I don't know, it was ancient Chaldee or was Persian. It might have been Persian. And it said, number, counted, completed. And that very night, in other words, he was telling Belteshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, that you aren't a great king like your grandfather was. And this very night, God has completed and ended your reign. And it was that same night that the Persian army dammed up the river that flowed beneath the city of Babylon. And while the party was going on, and while, King Belteshazzar, the Bible says, got so scared that his joints, the joint of his loins were loosened. That's a fancy biblical term for saying that he had a depends moment, and he used the bathroom. He had a bowel movement on himself because he was so scared when he saw the handwriting being written into the wall. A few hours later, the Persians came in without having to raise a sword, sort of like the Trojan War, where the Trojans were defeated when the Spartans, the Greeks, hid themselves in a Trojan horse that was supposedly going to be dedicated to their god Poseidon. So, they opened up their barriers, their walls, because the walls of Troy were impregnable, and they brought the horse in, which they were going to, burn and sacrifice.
I was going to say, that's the early Burning Man thing, no?
A type of the Burning Man, I'm not sure if I would say that. It was a horse, but what it was done, what the Trojans were led to believe, is that they had been fighting for several days with the Greeks, had a combined army, including Sparta and Ithaca, and I forgot what the other major kingdom was. Menelaus ruled over Sparta, Athens, the different, city-states of Greece were united together against the Trojans, but they had such impenetrable walls, they couldn't get through and win. So they pretended to leave, and they took the ships around and hit them on the other side of the island, and they left a big wooden horse as a tribute, supposedly, so that the Trojans would pray that they would get safe passage across the sea, and Poseidon wouldn't, get revenge on them, for attacking Troy. And against the better advice, King Priam, the king of the Trojans, took the horse inside, though his son Paris said, don't bring it inside. This is a bad idea. Burn it. Dad brings it inside, and that night, when the Trojans all went to sleep, the Spartans and the rest of the Greeks came out of the Trojan horse and subverted the city without having to knock down the walls. The same sort of thing happened with the Babylonians. They dammed up the river that flowed beneath the city of Babylon through these impenetrable walls. The Persians couldn't. Persians were a new kingdom which had arisen after Nebuchadnezzar. And they were the chest of silver, because they were awesome. They weren't as awesome as Nebuchadnezzar was when he was ruling Babylon. That's why he couldn't be defeated. But after he died, another kingdom came along that was inferior to him, but was superior to all the other kingdoms of the world. That was the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire dammed up the river, went beneath the city walls in the footpath created by what would have been the river, and came up on the other side and was able to take over the city of Babylon that very night without having to fire a shot. They didn't have guns in those days, but if they did, they wouldn't have had to fire them. And they took over the city. And as a result, the Persian Empire became the new kingdom of the world, the inferior kingdom. Eventually, a great warrior and king of a rival nation called Media, was ruled over by a guy by the name of Darius. Darius was a great and mighty warrior, and what they decided to do is marry into the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was bigger, the Median Empire was smaller. Darius the Mede was a great ruler and basically married into the Persian Empire, so that we had a new united empire, which was known as Media-Persia. The Persians were the more dominant of the two. And so it is that nation, Media-Persia, that is ruling at the time that Esther is written. And Esther is one of the Jews that were left over after the Babylonian captivity, the deportation of the women and children to Babylon. Babylon was then taken over by the Persians, who united together with Media, so it became Media-Persia, and the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians became the new Babylon. And so it was the king at the time of, and so you'd have, at some point in time in the Bible timeline, you had Darius the Mede, who was the king of the whole kingdom. He came from the Median side of the empire. And then the other times you had the Persian kings. And the king that's in charge at the time of the Book of Esther is a king by the name of Xerxes. Xerxes is his Greek name. Ahasuerurus is his Hebrew name. His Persian name is Karashashkamash or something like that. We don't need to worry about the Farsi or the Persian. But Ahasuerus is how you're going to see it written in the King James Version, because that's the Hebrew name. But his Greek name was Xerxes. It's this same king, parenthetically, King Xerxes, who's sitting on the throne at the time of the Book of Esther, which we're going to be looking at tonight. His son, who eventually succeeded him when King Xerxes is not part of this story, but later on down the road, he's assassinated by his enemies. And the assassination plot is a big thing, because there's going to be an assassination plot in the Book of Esther. King Xerxes had enemies. He was a very rash, emotional sort of king, and he did a lot of rash and foolish things. He was motivated by sensuality, beautiful women, And, you know, he had an advisor who manipulated him. And so, before I forget, it's his son who eventually succeeds him when he is eventually, not in the Book of Esther, but further on down the road, he's eventually assassinated. And he's succeeded by his son. His son, his Greek name is Artaxerxes Longimanus.
Okay.
And it's the same Artaxerxes Longimanus that we were looking at last week when we were talking about Daniel and the metallic man. Remember, Daniel received the prophecy when he was in Babylon under the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. Toward the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the angel Gabriel came to Daniel, gave him the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Not 70 weeks of days, but 70 weeks of years, or 490 prophetic years that were divided out into two sections. The first section of which was the first 483 years, and the last section of which was the final 7 years of the 490 years. All taken together, it's the 70 weeks of Daniel, a timeline of human history leading right up to the second coming of Christ and the establishment of the millennial reign, but also starting out and leading up to the point in time when the Messiah will come to be sacrificed for the sins of the world. And so the 70 weeks of Daniel is generally split up by Bible prophecy scholars into two sections. The first 69 weeks of years of Daniel and the final 70th week of years of Daniel. So the first 483 years known as the 69 weeks of years, the final 7 years known as the 70th week of Daniel. It is the first 69 weeks of years that I want you guys to focus on right now. That first 483 years, if you divide it out into days, comes out to exactly 173,880 days, and is considered by most Bible prophecy scholars to be the most amazing prophecy in the Bible, because it predicts 483 years in advance to the very day, the day that the Messiah Jesus would show up on what day, Steve?
Palm Sunday.
On Palm Sunday of 32 AD. Nisan 10, 32 AD. So if you count backwards, 173,880 days, which Jesus expected the Jews of his day to do, you would have gotten a different date. You would have gotten Nisan 10 of 445 BC. And what is that date? That is the starting date, the Genesis date, for the 69 weeks of years prophecy, or the 483 years to the day prophecy when the Messiah will show up on Palm Sunday to be presented as the Passover lamb of the nation of Israel. How do we know that? And what is the starting point? Well, we find out from Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, that if you take a look at Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 27, you see the whole layout for the 70 weeks of years. It says, from the going forth of the command to restore and to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince shall be, basically, 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is a total of 69 weeks. The person who gave the decree to restore and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, from which the 69 weeks of Daniel is counted, was none other than, not Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian king, not Xerxes, but Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes Longimanus, we found out did, in fact, and we found it because it was engraved in a stone that was used as a seat, flipped upside down in the Persian amphitheaters, like the stadium, like you go to Michigan Stadium, you sit down in a seat. If you flipped it over, you saw, Caesar ordered French fries and a hamburger for lunch in, 445 BC. They found a historical record of the date that Artaxerxes Longimanus gave the decree to allow the Jews to go back. They'd already been allowed to go back by Nebuchadnezzar, or, if you look in Jeremiah, by Xerxes, they're allowed to return to the land, and we knew that that time is coming towards the end of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. But when the Persians took over, they were given permission to go back. But they were given additional permission to rebuild the walls. Now that's kind of a defensive thing. that normally, when they first were allowed to go back, they weren't allowed to rebuild the walls and rebuild the temple, because that meant that they were, preparing for war. Like, we want you to be our serf. We want you to be our servant. We're not going to let you build an army and build a wall like the city of Troy. We couldn't get in that doggone city of Troy because, because the walls were too big. And it's interesting, Troy and Sparta, actually, the Spartans actually come to rise because the Spartans and the Trojans existed, just prior to the time period we see of King Nebuchadnezzar and Darius the Mede and the Persian Empire. But it's interesting because there was a particular rule that had been put in place by Xerxes regarding bowing down to the king. And it was a tradition under the Persians that when you bow down to the king, it was different. The Jews could bow down to a king, in other circumstances, because it was just sort of like curtsying to the queen or something. But under the Persian iteration of the bowing to the king, you were acknowledging by your bowing that the king was in fact a god. We wouldn't see this again really until the Caesars got on the throne later, after the second temple was destroyed, when Caesar declared himself to be God and you had to worship him as God. And of course, Paul and all of the apostles and the disciples thereafter couldn't, acknowledge Caesar as a god, and so Christians were persecuted and thrown to the lions and all that stuff. Well, in Persia, when you bowed to the king, you were acknowledging him as sort of a god in human flesh. And so it was the Spartans who had conflict with the Persian Empire because they refused to bow to him, because they were like, we're not going to acknowledge you as a king. We already got a king. We got Zeus, that we worship as king. We're not going to acknowledge you and your Persian kings. They had the Persians had the divine Zoroaster and Zarathustra and the Zoroastrian gods. The Babylonian Empire, by the way, had Marduk as their official Babylonian city-state god, and it's from that name that the Jewish hero of the Book of Esther, there's a male and female. The male hero is a guy by the name of Mordecai, whose name is a derivation of Marduk, who was the god of the Babylonians because he was in captivity and became a ruler in the Persian Empire. But again, it was Artaxerxes Longimanus, the son of Xerxes, who's in the story tonight, that gave the decree to restore and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and that occurred in Nisan 10, 445 BC. So that gives you sort of the time frame that we're talking about when these events occur. The Spartans wouldn't bow down to the Persian king because it would be considered an act of worship that they weren't willing to acknowledge. They weren't going to acknowledge the Persian king as a god because they had their own gods. And there was another group of people separate and apart from the Spartans who refused to bow down to the Persian king because it also was considered, kingdom-wide, to be an act of homage to a human god, a god in human form. It was the Jewish people. And the Jews, even though they had been given permission at the end of the Babylonian captivity and at the beginning of the Persian captivity, and we can see that story, remember, when I believe it was Jeremiah that went into the King Xerxes and he was a great advisor, and he was like, man, you got a sad face. It's a sad face you have. And he says, what's wrong? Well, I got a request to ask. Can you let my people, the Jews, go back home? And can you grant it? And they allowed him to do it. And then sometime later, Artaxerxes Longimanus, his son, gave permission to restore and rebuild the walls. That's the 69 weeks of years. Now, all of that is sort of background for the Book of Esther. So we got a bunch of people in the Book of Esther that end up being important, kind of heroic figures and bad guy figures. And it's my proposition that the Book of Esther is a type or a shadow or a picture of two things. And the two things are the rise of the Messiah, the Christ, who will be an atoning sacrifice for the people, so that the people would live. The Messiah would have to subject himself to the potential of death. And it is Esther who is a Jewish girl living in Persia. Some of the Jews chose not to go back to the land of Israel or Judea at the time that they were given permission to do so, because the land was in ruins. Basically, we've been here for 70 now, over 70 years now. And so everything that my grandparents had in the land of Judea has been destroyed. The temple has been destroyed. We're not going to go back there. It's a wilderness now. Nebuchadnezzar, made it a dung heap. It's dust and rocks and nothing there. So imagine if you've been living in Babylon, which became Media-Persia, for 70 years during the Babylonian captivity, and then for another 10 or 20 years after you were given permission to go home, you chose not to. That means you would have been in the land of Persia or Babylon for almost 100 years. Now you can imagine the people in their 20s or 30s, they're thinking, I don't know anything about that. That's my grandparents, I looked in the photo album and I saw pictures of what Jerusalem looked like back then, but from what I've been told, it's been destroyed anyway, so we're not going back. We're going to stay here. We got our businesses here. We got our kids in school here. We got a good life. We know our neighbors. And, we got real estate investments in Persia. So some of them didn't go back. And so it was this setting in which the Book of Esther occurs. And so, again, Mordecai, which we're going to read about, it's a compound of the Babylonian Marduk, the state god of Babylon. And interestingly enough, there's another individual that's important here, and that's Esther. Esther is sort of the Persian word for star. She was this Jewish girl who was the cousin of Mordecai. Mordecai was a guy who was one of the Jews, just like Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, who had been taken captive in Israel, and then they had, people who had children. Mordecai was one of the Jewish kids that had been born during the time of the captivity and grown up to become a leader in the state of Media-Persia. And he became especially famous in that during his time as an advisor to King Xerxes, he found out about a plot to assassinate the king. And that's why I said later on we find out that he was assassinated. That's how Artaxerxes Longimanus got the job, and that's how he gave the decree to restore him and build the wall. But there was another plot to kill King Xerxes that had occurred even earlier. And Mordecai, the Jew, an advisor to the king, found out about it, foiled the plot, which resulted in the two would-be assassins being arrested and hung. And it was such a great feat that the act of Mordecai, the Jewish advisor to King Xerxes, was recorded in the official annals of the kingdom of Persia. And so the heroic deed of Mordecai saving the king, blah, 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 was written down in like a logbook. And so that ends up becoming important later on when the king suffers a bout of insomnia. And so Mordecai is this great leader. He has a cousin who he's raising as his own daughter. It's this young girl named Esther. Esther's Jewish name is Hadassah. She also, the Aramaic is myrtle, which is like a flower or branch. Esther is the Persian word. The Persian word means star. She apparently was so beautiful. She was like a flower blooming in the heavens, like a star. If you put a flower in the sky as a star, it would be her. So she was this really beautiful young girl whose parents were killed, and she was being raised by her cousin Mordecai. So Mordecai foils a plot to assassinate King Xerxes, and he becomes this big dude in the kingdom. There's a secondary point or secondary story also going on in the Book of Esther. King Xerxes, apparently at this point in time, is doing a series of battles with the hips of brass. So we have the head of gold, Babylon, which is succeeded by the Persian Empire, Media-Persia, the chest of silver, and then we have the hips of brass, which we found out later was what? It's the Grecian Empire. And remember, we found out that the Spartans, who were a precursor to the Grecian Empire of Alexander the Great, they already had issues with the Persian Empire because they wouldn't bow down to the king because they said that would be acknowledging me as a god. And we, the Spartans, refused to acknowledge the Persian king as a god. And the Jews were the only other people in the world who refused to do that very same thing. And so it was a series of wars that had been going on between Xerxes, the Persian king, and the Spartans. And, you know, the Spartans who eventually became sort of agglomerated into what became the Grecian Empire. The Grecian Empire was sort of united together. King Menelaus, you know, I think I made brief reference on Saturday when we were talking about the Nephilim and how Achilles and Hector and Ajax were these characters in the epic ancient literature related to the Trojan War. One, the Iliad, the other, the Odyssey, written by Homer and Virgil, you know, depicting these supermen like warriors from both the Trojan, Spartan, and Grecian armies who were probably real Nephilim, you know, metahumans. Wow. And so that all ties in together. It's amazing how mythology and history really coalesces, and if you understand and believe the Bible, you have an explanation for how it all fits together in a timeline forward. So what we had is, you know, after the Spartans were united together under their king Agamemnon, and they went to war against Troy for dominance of that particular passageway, that portion of the ocean, and eventually they destroyed the Trojans through the Trojan horse. We made mention of that, so on and so forth. Eventually, the efforts of Agamemnon to unite Athens and Sparta and the other Grecian city-states into one united Grecian Empire, that eventually, you know, really became coalesced under the reign of Alexander the Great, father, Philip of Macedon. He was from Macedonia, which was another important city-state that came along some centuries after, you know, Sparta. And, you know, Philip of Macedon sort of began the process of uniting the Grecian army together, the Grecian Empire together. It was eventually completed by Alexander the Great. But during this time of the Book of Esther, you already have the Grecian state or nation rising up and becoming a rival to the second most awesome, you know, kingdom ever to be established on the earth, the Media-Persian Empire, which is the chest of silver. So there were a series of fights that King Xerxes had engaged in, and he lost a couple of battles to the Greeks, and he was preparing for yet a third one. And what he would do is he would sort of sally forth from the castle to his harem. And he apparently had, you know, all the kings need a harem. You know, there was actually an official dude in the Bible makes reference to it. He's kind of like the official, you know, the ambassador of the House of the Women. All the beautiful virgins of the Persian Empire would gather together in a state-run house, and they'd all become part of the king's harem. And the king had a queen by the name of Vashti. And apparently he fell in love with her during one of the earlier battles with the Grecian Empire. And maybe she was unimpressed with the fact that he didn't win or something like that. But she gave him some trouble. He apparently liked to drink, and he threw a party. And depending upon who you're talking to from a historical standpoint, then there are some, Herodotus did some, you know, historical writings about Vashti and her relationship with Xerxes and the Spartans and so on and so forth, which is where I got some of this background information. Vashti was invited to a party that the king, you know, he threw this royal banquet, but it had been suggested by some, such as Herodotus, that maybe it was more like a drunken, you know, feast where, you know, have some let's bring in some strippers from the strip club, let's get the alcohol, and let's forget about losing that battle to the Greeks, and let's get together and get ready, get fired up for the next one. We're going to win that next battle. And so when and the first few times I read the story, I was like, you know, what a rebellious woman. You know, women always refuting the authority of man. But I'm kind of looking at it, you know, there's a possibility that Vashti wasn't, you know, really the bad guy here. Some people have suggested that he wanted her to come over and he was going to sort of show her off her physical beauty. And maybe she was going to have to do some kind of lewd dance. Think Salome, the teenage daughter
Which was in Matthew 13 or 14 tonight.
We looked at Matthew 14 tonight. Yeah. We'll get to that next week. As a matter of fact, King Herod was seduced by his illegal incestuous wife's teenage daughter to kill John the Baptist by her doing a sexy erotic dance at an official royal party. So we have an official royal party some centuries before what we're going to read at next week in Matthew 14, and we find out that Vashti was apparently going to be, the special attraction. So she decided, for whatever reason, and that may be, in defense of her, that may be the reason why she refused to come over. So she refused to come over from the Red Keep or whatever they called, where the queen lived in the Media-Persian Empire, and show up for this party. And so the advisor said, King, Vashti isn't coming over, man. It's going to send the wrong message. We're going to have feminism starting up, 3,200 years before it's going to, take effect, in the Western world in the United States. You can't allow the queen to tell you no and embarrass you in front of all your friends. Fire her. And so, basically, Queen Vashti got fired that night as the Queen of Persia. And then the king got busy getting ready for the next war with the Grecian Empire. And so he didn't get around to picking a new queen until like over a year later. And it was suggested to the king that, hey, some of the advisors didn't like Vashti in the first place, and they told him to fire her. So they didn't want him to hire her back as queen. So they said, why don't you have a beauty contest, have a beauty pageant? Dude, you'll have instead of the Miss America, Miss Universe pageant, we'll have Miss Media-Persia. And we'll be able to have all the beautiful young virgins from all over the kingdom. And the kingdom is spread out, pretty well, at this point. And then after they do the walk and, and of course there's the talent portion, but, and then finally, when the swimsuit competition comes out, you'll pick the real queen from out of the swimsuit competition, which is, of course, how all the beauty pageants work. And so they did that. And so Mordecai tells his little, cousin, Esther, who he calls Hadassah, hey, why don't you, I saw the poster up and, in the public square for the Miss Media-Persia beauty pageant. Why don't you run for it? You're beautiful and young and you're a virgin. And she's like, oh, little old me, I'm just a humble Jewish girl. It's like, tell you what, don't even mention that you're Jewish. Just show up. Take your little bathing suit and, you can play the ukulele during the talent portion. And, nobody can resist you when you're playing the ukulele. And who knows? Just don't mention you're Jewish and maybe you have a chance to win. And sure enough, they had the beauty pageant. Guess who won? She won. And so the king picked Esther. Now, this is what I would call a divine appointment. And this is where some of the passages in the book of Esther come out from where, who knows whether you are called into the land for such a time as this. The phrase for such a time as this has become this almost, a meme or a type in and of itself. For such a time as this, you hear Christians saying that all the time. That comes from the book of Esther. So Esther goes in, wins the beauty contest, and she's elected the new queen of Persia. Da, 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 da. And so now she's married to the king. But there's also a rule that says that if someone goes into the king's inner court, while he's in the inner court without being summoned, then they're to be killed on the spot unless the king extends the scepter towards you. Sure. So in other words, bother the king when he's in the inner sanctum at your own risk. Yeah. He may kill you, or he might hear you out. So, that was well understood. And it is at about this very same time that the king is, he's aware that, let's see. He has an advisor by the name of Haman. And Haman is this advisor who actually isn't Persian, but is himself, the Bible says, an Agagite, meaning he's a descendant of King Agag. King Agag we read about in 2 Samuel, who was a king that God told Samuel to kill. Kill the enemies of Israel, the Agagites, and their king Agag. And Samuel decided, you know what, I'm going to show mercy to the king and let him live, and to show everybody what a cool and merciful dude I am. And, you know, Chuck Missler has suggested that what really happened here is that King Agag was a descendant of the race of metahuman supermen that I made reference to regarding Troy and the Trojan War. You look in the Aeneid or the Odyssey, you had these supermen, Achilles and Ajax and Hector, who were basically modern day superheroes in the ancient times, who were battling amongst themselves. They were almost certainly descendants of the Nephilim, this race of God men descending down from Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. So Chuck Missler has suggested that King Agag was a descendant of one of these Nephilim, who were descendants of fallen angels who cohabitated with women and created a race of supermen that we see laid out in our timeline chart way back here, which sort of triggered or initiated the flood of Noah to kill off all the Nephilim offspring. But then it says they were on the earth in those days and also after that. So after that would have been during the Trojan Empire, would have been somewhere about right here. The Trojan War would have been right about at this time. Then eventually you got the Babylonian Empire rising, or the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and then you got the Persian Empire coming up right about here, which is where we're at in the Book of Esther. We're at right about this point, right at the conclusion of the 70 years captivity in Babylon. So what you now have is you've got this guy Haman, who is a descendant of King Agag, who might have been a Nephilim himself. So it is inherent that in those individuals, since they are sort of the offspring of fallen angels, they're demonic spirits living inside of them anyway. And so they hate God, and because Satan is really their biogenetic father, they have a plot dating all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, to go to war against the seed of the woman, or the Messiah, and to try to destroy him. And so Chuck Missler has posited that if King Saul had done what God had told him and killed King Agag, the Agagites would have never become a race of Nephilim supermen. And eventually, Saul is killed by a descendant of King Agag when he's eventually killed, for going to the witch at Endor, and he's eventually killed the very next day. It is one of the descendants of King Agag that eventually kills him many years later, almost poetic justice. But then it's another descendant of King Agag who is now the top advisor to this Persian king, Xerxes, and his name is Haman. So Haman, who is a descendant of King Agag, who was a Nephilim, who should have been killed by King Saul, but because King Saul disobeyed, refused to listen to the voice of his God, and decided to listen to the voice of his, political advisor. Again, we have the whole story of the fall in Genesis happening all over again. When God tells us to do something and we don't do it, often we have consequences that go down the line, and generations of people have suffered as a result of this. So Haman was a type, I would submit to you, of the Antichrist. He was an anti-Semite. He hated the Jews. And one of the primary reasons why he hated the Jews was because Mordecai would not bow down to him. And since he was one of the officials of the king, the top official of the king, an insult to the king, off with your head. But an insult to the top advisor to the king is an insult to the king himself. So it sort of became a practice in Persia that when you saw the king or Haman, his top advisor, you would bow down. But the Spartans couldn't bow down because, again, remember, they were like, we got our own gods, we're not acknowledging you as a god. But guess who else couldn't do it? The Jews couldn't do it either. So Mordecai, who had already ingratiated himself by solving a plot to assassinate the king, he gets apparently promoted when Esther becomes the queen of Persia. She may have talked to Xerxes, and he got promoted to a position of magistrate, like sort of one of the chief judges of the city. So he sat in the king's gate, which kind of like you have this sort of, if you think of Washington Square Park in New York City, right across the street from NYU, you've got, sort of a replica of Trajan's arch, sort of a Romanesque sort of circular arch with a square on top of it. It looks like, almost like a rectangular object with an arch in the middle of it. And the Romans would ride through that when they would come back from conquering victories, and the Grecians had something similar to that. And so it was something like that where the magistrates or the judges of Persia would sit. And so apparently Mordecai got promoted to that position. And when he saw Haman one day, he wouldn't bow down. And he wouldn't bow down because for the same reason that Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel refused to eat King Nebuchadnezzar's food when they were in captivity in Babylon. Remember, as a result of that, one of the advisors to King Nebuchadnezzar said, hey, you got these Jews that won't, eat the ceremonial food, and they won't bow down to the image that you have erected. And so, Nebuchadnezzar, he's a nice guy, but his advisor told him, throw those people into the furnace. And he took them and threw them into the furnace. The same thing. Satan is working through these world leaders, which is why God doesn't want a new world order, which is why God confounded the original Babylonian Empire and changed the languages and made the Tower of Babel fall down, because he knew that Satan, once he gets one world ruler to take over, he can easily seduce and control him and then rule the world. And so you saw that happening with King Nebuchadnezzar, who was manipulated by an advisor under Satan's control into killing off Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. And then God supernaturally preserved them, Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And then, remember when King Nebuchadnezzar looked into the furnace, has your God been able to, King, live forever, we're still here and everything's good. And so he said, come on out, I'm going to give you a promotion. And the men that spoke against you threw them into the furnace. Same thing happened to Daniel. Daniel, my favorite advisor, has thy God of Israel, whom thou worship, been able to preserve you from the mouth of the lions who are hungry and terrible? Like, King, live forever. Here I am. I'm doing just fine. He's like, come on out. And now, as a result of that, we're going to take the men and the men that put you in the lions, and we're going to throw them in there. And then he threw the guys who put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace. He said, only heat up the furnace 10 times hotter, so that when they opened the furnace doors, it killed all the men that opened the door, but it didn't kill Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We have the same sort of thing happening now, several decades later, in the Persian Empire that had already happened in the Babylonian Empire. Again, God is supernaturally showing his providence for the people of Israel, for the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism, I have submitted to you many times, is a satanic attempt to frustrate the messianic prophecies in the Bible about the first coming of the Messiah, which we saw occurring in about 4 BC, which is why King Herod tried to kill off all the male child from 2 years of age and under to kill off the Messiah, because he heard about the Magi, the sign of the star in the east, and the Magi came to worship the Messiah. This must be the time for the Messiah to be born. I know that prophecy. Kill all the kids, all the male child. But that was under Satan's influence. And so we have that very same thing happening again in Persia. Only this time, a probable descendant of the line of Nephilim kings, King Agag, the Agagite by the name of Haman, now sees Mordecai, who is now a judge or magistrate in Persia, and when he walks by, Mordecai doesn't bow down to him, and all the other advisors and magistrates bow down. And Haman gets upset. Like, who's this guy think he is? And some of the other magistrates, hey, how come you don't bow down to, that's the king's, top right-hand man. And as a result of that, you got to bow down, or, you'll be thrown, or you're violating the rules of the king. He says, I can't, because I worship the God, and we don't see God's name mentioned, but again, we know that the Jewish people have their own God from Israel. Even though they're living in a foreign land, they won't acknowledge another God. And so Haman sets forth a plot to gain revenge on Mordecai for refusing to bow down to him. And in fact, he says, all those Jews are troublemakers, and they've gathered all the wealth of the nation together, and I'm going to get back at them, and I'm going to do it by having the king sign a decree to kill all the Jews. It is Adolf Hitler's Holocaust occurring, 3,200 years in advance. And so what we see Haman doing is manipulating the king, who's kind of naive and gullible and maybe narcissistic a little bit. He says, hey, king, guess what? There's a people scattered throughout your empire who do not obey the commandments of the king and won't acknowledge you as the chief ruler and bow down before you and show you respect and obedience in all the land. And he says, well, what sort of people is this? This is an outrage. How dare these people? Something should be done about this. And he says, oh, king, I've got an idea. He says, you give me the permission, and I'll prepare a decree in your name, which says we can go out and we'll kill every last one of them. And guess what, king? They own a lot of property, real estate, and a lot of money. And I can assure you, in the King James Version, I think it's like 10,000 talents of silver or something. What he basically is saying is that if you give me permission to prepare a decree in your name to kill those people, I can seize their assets for the state, and I can guarantee you, I can put into your treasury what's been estimated by modern day scholars to be about $3.98 billion. In other words, just under $4 billion in assets will I be able to seize from these Jews if you allow me to kill them, and I can take their property, their holdings, and their bank accounts and put it in your treasury. Now, would that be something you might be interested in, O king? He's like, Haman, you go ahead and, here's my blank check, you put my name on it, here's my signet ring, you stamp it, whatever you think is appropriate, do it. If you can get $4 billion in the treasury, I'm all for it. And so he basically bribed the king by, one, giving false information about, the Jews, trying to make them out to be rebels, as opposed to them having a religious inability to bow down. And so the king signs a decree. Haman has it sent, put up on posters. And so now here's where the portion related to the lots or the dice or the pur, which is what it was called in the Persian tongue. Haman had to decide what day of the month are we going to kill all the Jews, because he was preparing the king's decree, and he was like, okay, I got to have a day. So he took some dice and he rolled them, which there weren't any dice, they were pur. And he had more than one, he had two of them. So it's Purim, which is sort of the Hebrew suffix for plural form. So he took two dice, or two pur, which is the Persian dice, rolled them, and came up with a date to kill all the Jews. And after he came up with the date, he put it on the posters and on the decree, had the king sign it, and put the posters of all through the Persian Empire. On this date, all Jews everywhere are to be put to death, and their property and assets seized in the name of the king, and anyone who doesn't will be put to death. And so Mordecai finds out about it, and he's super depressed. Oh my gosh! And it turns out the date ends up being, I think, the day before, on Nisan 13. Nisan 13 is a special date because it's the date before the special Passover preparation date, Nisan 14. Remember, Nisan 10 is the 178,880th day after the decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus, the son of Xerxes, the Persian king. That's the day that Jesus rides into Jerusalem in 32 AD on Palm Sunday to present himself to be killed as the Passover lamb for the nation of Israel, to die for the sins of the people. And 4 days after that is Nisan 14. That's when you actually put the Passover lambs to death. These Jews, according to this decree, were all going to be put to death on Nisan 13, the day before the day that the Passover. So again, you see all kinds of types and shadows of the death of Israel is coming, and then you have an intercessor that's going to rise up out of nowhere to save the day. And so it's at that point we get to Mordecai and Esther. And so remember, Esther is now the beautiful young queen of Persia, and Mordecai has raised her sort of as a daughter. Your parents got killed, I took you into my house and whatever. Listen, I don't know if you've seen this yet, but your husband signed a decree saying all of us are dead. And so listen, cuz I want you to go in and talk to your husband, talk some sense into him, and tell him not to kill the Jews. and just, you pull out your trump card. Not to raise a sore subject with evangelical Christians who are upset that Trump's not president anymore. Pull out the trump card, tell him you're a Jew. Because remember, when she entered the Miss Persia beauty contest, she didn't tell him she was a Jew, and she ended up winning. So he doesn't even know she's Jewish. So just tell him you're a Jew, and all your friends and relatives are going to be put to death, and maybe you'll sway them. And she said, look, the king hasn't called me, because in those days, remember, the king has a harem, so he lives in the palace in his own king suite. And the queen apparently had the queen suite, but she didn't share the same bed on a nightly basis with the king. She didn't get to come into the king's bed unless he called for her, because he had, remember, like 1,000 other women, and he might call for Jackie tonight and tomorrow. I mean, it's good to be the king, Steve. Well, you and I living our whole lives here on the earth, and not one wife to share between the two of us. And I got to read all these biblical stories in the Old Testament about Solomon with 1,000 concubines and 652 wives. And now I got to read about this Persian dude who's got a whole castle full of beautiful young virgins to pick from, and and all that. It just doesn't seem fair. Where is the equitability and equal justice under law? So anyway, so she says to Mordecai, listen, cuz the king hasn't called for me in 30 days. What do you mean? It's like, oh, I got the queen suite, but that's down the hall and to the left of the kingly suite. And if anybody goes into the king when he's in his special period of rest and solitude without being called for, the rule says you got to be put to death. And so it's the famous line that Mordecai comes back with, and he says, don't think, cuz, that you are going to escape the fate of death of all the other Jews, because if you won't go in on behalf of the people, he doesn't mention God by name, but he clearly is referencing God. He says, salvation will come for the Jews from another place. But who knows, cuz? Maybe you were brought into the land and made queen of Persia for such a time as this. And so basically it plays upon her guilt and her sense of commitment to her people, the Jews, overcomes her fear, because she's a teenage girl. She knows that Xerxes won't hesitate to put people to death. And that's exactly what he would do if he's of a mind to. So she says, okay, and in light of the fact that you mentioned that for the sake of my people, the Jews, I'm going to do what is not lawful for a person to do in the Persian kingdom, and I'm going to go into the king, and I'm going to tell him I'm a Jew, and I'm going to intercede on behalf of all the Jewish people before the king. And that's a type of what Christ is doing. He's going before the throne of God the Father and risking the wrath of God the Father on behalf of the people he's trying to save. And she says, and if I perish, I perish. So she's like, look, chances are good he's going to kill your cousin. But so what? I'm going to do it anyway. In other words, she's not saying she's going to go on because she's so confident she can swim. She's saying, I don't know whether he's, I can swim or not. I don't know whether I'm going to end up getting my head cut off for doing it, but I'm going to do it anyway. Just like what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had said a few years earlier under the reign of Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar before the Persians took over. Remember when they said, look, you got to bow down and worship the statue of Nebuchadnezzar because, under the rule that was set up, you got to do it. And even Nebuchadnezzar was saying, look, I can't reverse. I signed the order already. I can't reverse myself. Look how Satan uses beautiful women and clever advisors to manipulate the kings. And these kings, in every instance, wanted to back out but couldn't to save face. Herod made an oath. I'll give you up to half my kingdom, teenage dancing girl Salome. What do you want? I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter because Mama said to ask for it. He was like, oh, wait, anything but that. He's like, oh. And then his other guests, King, you made an oath. Are you not going to? And so Herod didn't want to grant, he was scared of John the Baptist. He didn't want to cut his head off. But he said, people will think I'm a hypocrite and the king's word will be no good. You have to do it. The same thing happened to Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It was like, oh, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you guys are my best advisors. I don't want to have to do this to you. Why don't you just bow down and worship the image? You know, the satraps and the such and so, and when the bells and the tingles and when the censer and the cymbals go off, just fall down real quick, and that'll be it. He says, oh, king, live forever. We can't, you know. And it says, but if not, I got to throw you into the fiery furnace. And this is what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, which so impressed me. He said, listen, we understand exactly what the rule says. We don't bow down. You have to throw us into the fiery furnace. We understand that's the law. You can't reverse it. And, you know, if you throw us into the fiery furnace, our God is able to preserve us even in the fiery furnace. But, they go on to add, even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down and worship the stupid image that you've erected, O king. And the king is like, dang. So in other words, they're not saying we're willing to face the fire furnace because we know our God is an awesome God and he's guaranteed us, you know, Kim Clement has prophesied over us that there's no harm that's going to befall us. No, they're saying, look, you know, our God isn't a cosmic Santa Claus. He's able, if he wants to preserve us through the fiery furnace. But he might not want to. And so we're going to just get burned up. But either way, we're not going to bow down and worship the stupid image that you've erected. And the king was like, okay, toss him in. And then God supernaturally, hey, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you know, I see, I threw 3 people in the fire, but there's a 4th one walking around in the fire, and none of them are hurt. And the 4th one is like unto the Son of God. Pre-incarnate epiphany, you know, Christophany, appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. We have the same sort of thing happening now in Persia with Esther. So Esther now goes strolling on in to the king's inner chambers, not knowing that she's going to die. Now, king, I got something to ask you, honey. I know you didn't call for me for a month because you got a lot of things about the Grecian war coming up that's worrying you. And you know, maybe you read the prophecy in the book of Jeremiah or in the book of Daniel, you know, made available for publication a few weeks ago, that eventually you're going to get replaced by the hips of brass, and you found out that this is the Grecian Empire. I know that's probably bothering you, but I got a request to make of you. And he takes the scepter and he dramatically extends it to her, which allows her to live. And so the satraps standing by, who were ready to chop her head off, were unable. So they're like, "What is it, honey? What do you want? I've been busy, you know." Oh, well, listen, I got a request to make of you, but I'm going to throw a banquet tomorrow, and then I'm going to ask you. And so she has him come to this banquet and invites Haman, the advisor that plotted to kill the Jews, and then you know, another banquet goes to and says, listen, you know, there is a great person in the kingdom who should, you know, that you should reward and honor with great glory because he's done such great things to you. And I would like for you, you know, to exalt him. Basically, she's asking, you know, for the life of Mordecai to be preserved. And in doing so, to preserve the life of all of, you know, the Jewish people. And so, in sum and substance, what happens is at the second banquet, she says that she eventually reveals that she's a Jew, and that her cousin Mordecai is a Jew, and that he wants her to save all the people, and that an evil plot has been hatched to kill her and all the Jews. And she says, who's done this evil plot? He says, your advisor Haman has done it. And so the king gets mad and says, goodness forbid, this man should die. And then Haman freaks out and throws himself at the queen, like, save me, what are you doing, little girl? You can beat her. And then, you know, the king says, wilt thou also assault the queen while she sits upon the throne? You're a dead man. But prior to that, interestingly enough, the king had a night of insomnia. He couldn't sleep. And it was because he couldn't sleep, he read the annals of the city of Persia and found out that there was this great hero, Mordecai, who had, you know, saved him from assassination. So he decided to reward Mordecai by giving him a promotion and giving him salary increase and special clothes, and he didn't mention him by name, and he ran it by Haman. He said, Haman is this great guy in the kingdom, and I want to give him a special reward, and I want to raise his salary like 250%. Can the salary, can the treasury handle that? And Haman thought it was him that was going to get the raise and the promotion. He was like, yeah, absolutely, king, I'll live forever. We can handle it. And so he eventually reveals that it's Mordecai that he's going to give the promotion to, and Haman hates him even more, and that's part and parcel of why he wants this plot. He won't bow down to me, and he's getting my reward. Oh, I'm going to have him put to death. So now Esther reveals that she's a Jew, that Mordecai's a Jew, and that Haman's hatched a plot to kill all the Jews. And lo and behold, the Lord puts it in the heart of Artaxerxes to turn against Haman, who's this Agagite, and says, the man, and interestingly and ironically enough, Haman had the government city employees, the Parks and Recreation Department, build a 75-foot scaffold to hang Mordecai on, so the whole city could see him hanging, and this is at Susa, which was sort of the capital of Persia at the time. So he was going to hang him on a scaffold 75 feet high. Maybe it's sort of a type or picture of Christ being crucified. And the king said, hang this man. So Haman, who had the gallows erected to kill Mordecai, and then shortly thereafter all of the Jews, he ends up getting hung on the very scaffold that he had hatched or plotted to kill off all the Jews. And so, happy ending, Haman, the Agagite, son of a Nephilim king Agag, who Saul should have killed centuries earlier, but didn't, eventually hatches a plot for the total genocide of the Jews.
Wow.
And uses as the bribe or the manipulation for the king is what? We're going to seize their assets and we'll give them to you. That's exactly what happened during the Holocaust with Adolf Hitler.
Wow.
One of the motivations when they sent the brown shirts, who were these special sort of, remember he had the Gestapo and the SS, which was the Schützenstaffel, was the special secret police that wore the black uniforms for Hitler. But then he had the SA, which was the, I forgot, the SA is the Schützenarbeit something or other. Yeah. They were the brown shirt guys that would go on and do the work, the dirty work. And they went on Kristallnacht, and they went out through all of Germany and broke the windows of all the Jewish shops and arrested all the Jewish people and took diamonds and the cash registers and seized all their property. And so part and parcel of the motivation of Hitler and his leaders and the German people was, hey, if we get rid of all these Jews, we can seize their assets and we can enrich ourselves. And that's what Haman had convinced the king to do. And he says, I can get you almost $4 billion in assets. And so Haman is now hung and dead. And now Mordecai's like, okay, this is awesome. Well, happy ending. And so the queen's like, oh, so now of course you'll revoke, sign an executive order revoking the previous executive order, saying all the Jews will be killed on this day, Nisan 13, which is the day that was picked by Haman when he cast the lots, or through the Purim, to decide what day all the Jews should die on. And the king says, look, I talked to the city attorney's office, and they said that once I signed the decree, I can't reverse it. So he's in the same boat that Nebuchadnezzar's in. Mm-hmm. He said, listen, even if I don't want to throw you into the fiery furnace, I can't now. I already signed the decree that whoever doesn't bow down has to be put to death. Now, Daniel was out of the country when that happened, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to go into the fiery furnace. He says, I can't reverse it because it's the law. I don't know why, but these, the city attorney people tell me I can't do it. And so he says, I got an idea. Mordecai, write up a decree, and I'll sign that says you guys can fight to defend yourself and whatever and so on. And so a decree is written up by Mordecai saying, all the Jews throughout the land, the king has given you permission to go to war and defend. If anybody tries to attack you on Nisan 13, whatever date it is, it was 62 or 462 BC, you can fight back, and if you kill them, nothing will happen to you. There'll be no penalties. You'll get complete amnesty because they attacked you first. And so that decree went out throughout all the land, and on the day when all the Jews were supposed to be put to death, they fought back, and the Lord gave them a mighty victory, and they won in all the land. And so you had a happy ending. And as a result of that, the very next day, a big celebration was held. And the big celebration was called the Feast of Purim, for it was a day acknowledging Haman casting the lots, or the Purim, and deciding what day all the Jews were supposed to die on.
Wow.
And the day after all the Jews were supposed to die, you know, was I believe now Nisan 14, which is kind of the Passover day where all the Passover lambs die, which is a type of the nation of Israel and all the children of men being saved by the blood sacrifice of one that God has specifically sent to save the Jewish people. They throw this big celebration that is celebrated even unto this day, and started, like I said, now about an hour and 20 minutes ago. The Feast of Purim started here in Miami Beach in 2021 on the East Coast in the Eastern Standard Time Zone about an hour and 10 minutes ago. And so that's where the whole story of the Book of Esther. Now, I gave you the background. So Steve, why don't we hit some of the key verses? And, you know, that'll, as we're reading along, you kind of will already know some of the stuff, you know, that I thought it was best to just lay out that story for you. And then, you know, we'll take a look at a few select verses that will be helpful for us in being able to piece the story together. So why don't you read for us, Steve, 1 through 5 of 1 through 5, chapter 1.
Okay. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces, that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, and nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace.
Is that number again? 7 is very important.
Sure.
So King Ahasuerus, that's again in Greek, King Xerxes. Now he's saying the powers of Persia and Media. Media-Persia has now already been united into the Media-Persian Empire. Now, let's pick it up, verse 9 through 12, and we'll find out about his original wife, Queen Vashti.
Also, Vashti, the queen, made a feast of the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagatha, Zethar, and Carcas, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the royal crown, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him.
Okay, now let's see what the king decides to do about it after talking to his advisors. Verses 19 through 22 of Esther chapter 1.
If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and of the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the same pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters unto all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people.
So Vashti gets fired. Now we're going to find out the king decides to get a replacement for himself. So let's fast forward to chapter 2 of Esther and read for us, Steve, verses 5 through 10.
Okay. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemi, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away from Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. For she had neither father nor mother. The maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her tidings of purification, which such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it.
Okay. Let's take a look. What verse was that?
That was 10.
Okay. And so now let's fast forward to verses 15 through 20, and let's see how Esther ascends to the throne after winning the beauty pageant.
Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerurus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in the sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet showed her kindred, nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him.
Okay, so now we're going to talk, briefly mention the plot to murder the king and how Mordecai gets a special enhanced position as a result of that. Verses 21 to 23, Steve. Okay. Give that to us really quickly.
In those days when Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king was known to the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out therefore that they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king.
So now Mordecai's deed is recorded. The king doesn't know about it, but it's written in the book, and he's going to eventually read it when he has a sleepless night, and he's going to want to give Mordecai a promotion as a result of it. Now let's fast forward to chapter 3, and let's take a look and see Haman gets himself a promotion as well. And let's take a look and see verses 1 through 6 of chapter 3, and let's see how Haman is starting on his ascension to the top, and how it fills him with jealousy and envy, and he now eventually will come to loggerheads with Mordecai. So verses 1 through 6, chapter 3.
After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite.
Again, Agagite meaning a descendant of King Agag, who should have been killed by Saul way back in 2 Samuel, but didn't because Saul was trying to prove what a cool guy he was, merciful and mighty, and he let a Nephilim king live who bred a line of demonized Agagites who ended up killing Saul and almost wound up wiping out all of the Jews in the land of Media-Persia, which would have done what, Steve? It would have frustrated and ended the Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 prophecy about the seed of the woman coming to destroy the seed of the serpent. And if you kill off all the Jews, then you don't have a Jesus to come back to rescue the Jews, because there's no Jews to come back to rescue. So Satan has been trying to kill off the Jews ever since they've been brought into existence supernaturally by God through Abram and Sarah. That's why anti-Semitism exists. That's why the Babylonian captivity occurred. That's why the Egyptian captivity occurred. That's why the Holocaust of Adolf Hitler in World War II occurred. Because Satan is still attempting to eradicate Jews from the face of the earth. That's why anti-Semitism is on the earth now. And that's why during the reign of the Antichrist, that Antichrist, who I would submit to you, is sort of a type of Haman. Haman is a type of the Antichrist. He's going to again try to reinvoke the Holocaust, the decision of Haman to eradicate the Jews, so that if he can kill off all the Jews before the second coming, before the conclusion of the 70th week of Daniel, then Jesus can't come back at the second coming and fulfill any prophecies, because he's got no one to come back for. So, I'm sorry, I digress.
That's fine. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman, to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath.
Oh boy, so Haman's upset now. So now, let's pick it up in verse 7, and let's see. Verse 7 through 9, Haman is coming up with his plot to gain revenge on Mordecai, and by extension, or all the Jewish people who refused to bow down. Verse 7 through 9 of Esther chapter 3.
In the first month, that is, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerurus, they cast pur, that is, the lot, before Haman from day to day, and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasuries.
So, that amount says, if it pleases the king, let there be a decree, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work. 10,000 talents, again, as of the mid-1980s, was worth about $3.84 billion. Today, it would be probably just over $4 billion in assets. That, when you're reading the King James, a little harder to understand. He's saying, kill off the Jews, we can seize their assets, and I can guarantee you an uptick deposit into the royal treasury of about $4 billion in assets. So, as a result of that, verses 10 through 13, Steve.
And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Haman-the the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, The silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as seemeth good to thee. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, And there was written according to all that Haman had commanded under the king.
13th day, that's Nisan 13. That's the day before Nisan 14.
Which is...
Oh boy. And remember, they celebrate the next day, the day they throw the Purim party. That would have been Nisan 14, which was the day that, you know, they really should be celebrating because Jesus is on the cross being crucified in their stead. And the land of Israel and all the Jewish people and all people inferentially, the same day that the Purim feast is being celebrated, we find Jesus being crucified. That's an aside. Nisan 13 and 14, very important dates in the Bible.
Yes. The governors that were over every province and the rulers of every people of every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerurus was it written and sealed with the king's ring.
All right, so now let's jump forward to now, you know, king's ring and signet ring, put the stamp on it. That means, okay, on the date, Haman has already cast his lot and come up with a date to kill all the Jews, and the signet ring of the king has been used, so that's the date that it has to happen no matter what. So now let's fast forward chapter 4 of Esther and read for us verses 1, 2, and 3, Steve.
When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud voice and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. All
right, so now we have Jews fasting and praying and being upset. So what Mordecai decides to do is to go to Esther. Hey, my cousin, she's the queen. Maybe she can help us out in all of this. Let's pick it up in chapter 4, starting at verse 8.
Okay, how far?
And run that through verse 14, 8 through 14.
Okay. Also, he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hattach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spake unto Hattach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death. Except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in, that's what she says, but I have not called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words.
Stop right there. So again, now Esther is saying, hey, listen, tell, cousin Mordecai that, look, there's a law in the land that says whether you're male or female, rich or poor, if you go into the inner court when the king is sitting there without being called, there's a law that says you have to be put to death. He can, wave it with the wave of his magic scepter, but he doesn't have to. The presumption is when you walk in there, you're going to be put to death. So you go tell my cousin this. And so when Mordecai hears this, we pick up his response to Esther in verse 13 and read for us his response in verses 13 and 14.
Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlarge and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?
That's where you get this famous passage. And so in the New King James has a slightly modified English translations. Verse 13 says, then Mordecai told them to answer Esther, quote, do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. So it shows already, he already has a supernatural faith that I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. There's a messianic prophecy relating to the Messiah that has yet to be fulfilled. And we all know it's going to be. So even if you won't help out, relief is going to come.
Yeah.
He could have inserted God's name right there.
Sure.
Clearly, he's talking, God's going to provide a supernatural relief from another place. Mm-hmm. And you and your father's house are going to perish because you passed up on the opportunity. But then he says, yet who knows whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this. So Mordecai's playing like on our balls, this young teenage girl. He's like, look, don't think that you can skate out of this by not telling the king that you're a Jew. Because if you do that, thinking that you can remain silent, you're going to save yourself from all the other Jews. No, God's going to raise up deliverance from another place, and you and your father's house will be destroyed. But hey, who knows? Maybe God has put you in this place as queen of Persia for such a time as this. Think about it. And apparently she does think about it, because she gives a response in verses 15 to 17 that's very powerful when you think and realize it's coming from a teenage girl. She's a girl, first off. She's a teenager whose mother and father have already been killed. She's got no parents. She's an orphan, a girl, and a teenager. And she gives this brave and bold response on behalf of the people. Verse 15 to 17.
Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him.
I love that. It says, I'm going to fast for 3 days, night and day. And there's that 3 days and 3 nights, Steve. Again, you have a supernatural reference to the time period that Jesus has to spend in the earth. Jesus invokes Jonah in the whale's belly for 3 days and 3 nights. She's fasting. Esther, who's a type of the Christ, is fasting for 3 days and 3 nights. Again, the Bible is supernaturally using the Old Testament to point the Jews from the Old Testament towards the Messiah who is yet to come. And she says, and so, I will go into the king, which is unlawful for me to do. If I perish, I perish. And so, brave and bold. So, we'll jump ahead. We'll run out of time. Chapter 6. Let's take a look and see. Remember I told you that the king couldn't sleep, and he found out that Mordecai was a superhero, not a Nephilim, but a really good guy, and he planned to give him an honor based on what we pick up in verse 1 through 3 of chapter 6.
On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerurus. And the king said, what honor and dignity hast thou done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman was come in. Am I going to 4 or just 3?
4.
Okay. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king, to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him.
Wow. So we find out Haman had prepared a gallows to hang Mordecai. King says, who's in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that they prepared for him. And so the king sees Haman, he says, hey, let him come in. And then we find out that the king wants to honor Mordecai. But Haman mistakenly thinks that the king is trying to honor him. And so there's this whole confusion thing. And when Haman finds out that it's Mordecai that the king wants to honor, he can't tell him, well, hang this dude. I already built the gallows. Mm-hmm. He's like, oh, shoot, what am I going to do? So he goes home and talks to his wife, and his wife says, look, the king told me to honor Mordecai and give him a robe and give him a promotion and give him a salary. And Haman's wife says, look, you got a problem. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but surely will fall before him. And so the wife is like, man, we're going to have to get rid of all of these people. And so the king now wants to honor Mordecai. Haman is even more angry because he wanted to tell the king to hang Mordecai, but now he's got to hold off on that because, he found out the king is favorable because God put it in his heart to not be able to sleep. Mm-hmm. And he went and read the annals of the city and found out that Mordecai saved his life. And so we pick it up in verse 7 and run for us through verses 1 through 4, if you would, Steve. And we'll see that now Esther is getting up the courage to reveal to the king that which she said she was going to reveal.
So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said unto Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, and I and my people to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage.
It's interesting, in the New King James Version, it makes reference as, and Esther said, well, go ahead. You ended on verse...
That's up to 4.
Okay. All right. And so we found out that she's beginning to tell the story to the king. Now she's going to, come right out and reveal that Haman is the evil guy that has plotted the destruction of Mordecai the hero. So like, there's an evil dude who's trying to kill Mordecai. Like, who would plot such a thing? And she reveals who it is. Verse 5 through 8.
Then the king Ahasuerurus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he, that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is the wicked Haman.
And so, interesting that term in Hebrew, Hasatan, the adversary. Haman is a type of Satan, a type of the Antichrist. And again, in Hebrew, when this is originally written, the phrase would be Hasatan, the same title that the Bible uses to apply to Lucifer, the prince of the power of the air, the adversary. And so, interestingly enough, the Holy Spirit uses these phrases to refer to Haman, again, who's a type of the Antichrist, a type of Satan in human flesh. And so, read verse 6 for us again, Steve.
And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen.
7 and 8.
And the king arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the words went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face.
In the New King James says, then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? I mean, that's like very direct. It's bad enough that I revealed the plot. Oh, you're going to assault my wife? No, I'm just asking. Come on, what is it? I'm just asking, begging for it. It's almost like the king has busted his shoes. Now, oh, you're going to assault my wife? Yeah. Why? You could at least wait till I left the house to assault my wife. And so now we see the fate of Haman, verses 9 and 10.
And Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold, also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good of the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified.
All right, so now we find out that, Esther has, eradicated the enemy who was plotting to have the entire house of Israel destroyed. And so, chapter 8, verse 3, pick us up there. She's now going to intercede on behalf of the people with the king.
And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews.
Verse 6.
For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come upon my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?
And so she's pleading with the people on behalf of, pleading with the king on behalf of the people. And so then we find out the king Ahasuerurus says, I've given, Esther the house of Haman. So basically they hung Haman, took his property and gave it to Esther as sort of a reward because of what he tried to do to the Jews. So the king in verse 7 says, I killed Haman and took his house, gave it to Esther as punishment for what he had to do. But he's basically saying that, but the decree, that I can't countermand that. And so verse 7 through 9, Steve, or give us verse 7 through 11.
Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you.
And what he's saying now is, Mordecai, hey, you can write your own decree.
Sure.
Fix this. I can't reverse it because it violates the rules. I don't know why, because I didn't go to law school. But you write a new executive order. I'll sign it, and you put in there whatever you think will fix the problem. And this is what they come up with.
In the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is, the month Sivan, on the 3 and 13th day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants and the deputies and rulers of the provinces, which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing, and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders of mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province, would assault them, both little ones and women, to take the spoil of them of a prey.
Okay, now we'll pick it up in chapter 9, verses 1 through 5, Steve. What happens when the day of judgment for the Jew comes? We see that God allowed a might, because of this decree that the king signed. Now all the Jews are being told they can take up arms to defend themselves, and no harm will come to them. And the king won't, they'll get angry. You kill off the people that try to attack you, and the king's not going to prosecute you. So everybody is now preparing to defend themselves. And this is what happens on the day of that was intended by Haman to be the day of the Holocaust of the Jews. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 5.
Now in the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in the cities there throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerurus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt. And no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and the officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did they what they would unto those that hated them.
So that was day one of the day of Holocaust. There was a 2-day period of time, I guess, when Haman cast the lot. It came up with 2 dates, and there was going to be a second day. So the next day will be day 2 of the Holocaust of the Jews. And so we'll pick it up in verse 12 to see what happens during day 2 of the Holocaust. Picking us up in verse 12, run through verse 16.
And the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace. And the 10 sons of Haman, what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. Or what is thy request further? And it shall be done. Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow, also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it so to be done, and the decree was given at Shushan that they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month of Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had a rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 75,000, but they laid not their hands upon the prey.
Now, I don't know if we can get a clear picture of what is really happening here. I've read this several times, I never really picked up what really is happening here is a Holocaust has been declared, and because the king can't reverse it, he's now given Mordecai permission to write a new rule that says you get to fight back. But you've got the whole kingdom of Media-Persia against the Jews who are scattered throughout the kingdom in small pockets. And on the second day, we find out all 10 of Haman's sons were captured and hung. And then, when the rest of the people who were Persians or Medians tried to attack the Jews, who were far outnumbered in the Media-Persian Empire, it says that these Jewish people who are shopkeepers and tellers and clerks and maybe the gemologists with wives and kids running around in the little yarmulkes and kappa, they killed 75,000 Media-Persians who had tried to kill them. They had rest from their enemies and killed 75,000 of their enemies, and they didn't lay a hand on the plunder, so they didn't lose anything. So the second day, they knocked off 75,000 people in addition to all the people that they had gotten rid of the first day. So you know this was a result of the supernatural power of God giving these Jewish people who were not soldiers or warriors the victory to be able to overcome, 100,000 people amassed against them over a 2-day war. And so as a result of that, the Feast of Purim, which is celebrated for 2 days now, starting today into tomorrow, and we'll go into Saturday, I believe, was instituted as a result of this. And we find that picking up at verse 17 and running all the way through verse 26.
On the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested they, and made in a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th day thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of gladness, and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerurus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them, because Haman, the son of Haman-the, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pure, that is, the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that this wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they call these days Purim, after the name of Pure. Therefore, for all the words of this letter and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, which had come unto them.
So we see in verse 27,
Wow.
It's instituted as a memorial for 2 days from that point onward. Verses 27 and 28.
The Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing and according to their appointed time every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed.
Verse 29.
Then Esther, the queen, and daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm the second letter of Purim.
And that's it. And there you have it. So today at sundown, we had the start of the Festival of Purim. But as we Gentiles who are followers of Jesus Christ, born again, having the Holy Spirit in us, as we study these scriptures, we find out the whole of the book, it says in the Old Testament. It is written of me.
Absolutely.
Jesus claimed that every book in the Old Testament, even the one that doesn't mention him or his Father in the entire book, is about him. And absolutely we see that it is. The Book of Esther is a type of the sacrifice that Jesus made when he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey on Nisan 10, 32 AD, on Palm Sunday, at the end of Daniel's 69 weeks of years, and then 4 days later on Nisan 14, when he's allowing himself to be crucified. Remember, he said, I could bring down 100 legions of angels.
Yeah.
You know, I could bring up 100,000 angels. And remember, one angel in the Old Testament killed 144,000 Syrian soldier warriors. One angel, in just the space of a few hours, killed 144,000 warriors. So Jesus said, I have 100,000 angels available to take out these Roman centurions if I wanted to. So he clearly wanted to be crucified. Why? So that he could be the Passover lamb on Nisan 14 of 32 AD. So that we could all wind up going to heaven and escape from the judgment and wrath of God in the lake of fire. So we find out then that Purim has been established as a feast or a festival, and the Jews are celebrating it today, and we'll celebrate it tomorrow. They may not fully understand the implications behind Purim. It is a type of the Messiah interceding on behalf of all of the Jewish people. Esther and Mordecai working together are a type of the Messiah, Jesus. And Haman is a type of the Antichrist, Satan, who's trying to eradicate all Jews, total genocide of the Jewish race from the earth, to frustrate the prophecies. So the title that I'm going to give for this teaching when we upload this to YouTube is going to probably be something like The Book of Esther and the Feast of Purim, a type of Messiah versus the Antichrist. And so for our Jewish friends that don't understand that, when they go to our YouTube page,
there you go.
they're going to get a chance to understand that there's more to it than just another Jewish festival. And for those of us that are Gentiles, we are getting an opportunity to understand and see. We already looked at the 7 feasts of Israel. We were looking at that this week. It's really the 7 feasts of the Lord that were implemented through Israel. But even as Gentile believers, we can see that Purim has meaning for us as well, because it is a type, a foreshadowing of what God had to do through his chosen people, the Jews, to be able to provide eternal life and salvation for the Gentiles who didn't have a Messiah of their own. There is no Gentile Messiah. Donald Trump, notwithstanding what the Republicans and conservative Americans think about Donald Trump, he was not the Messiah. We found out when he didn't win the election, after all these Bible prophecies, supposedly prophets saying he would win, we found out America doesn't have a Messiah. It isn't Donald Trump. It wasn't Ronald Reagan. It isn't going to be whoever the next conservative Republican that comes along is. The only Messiah for the Gentiles that live in the United States and the Gentiles that live anywhere else in the world is the Jewish Messiah, Jesus. And so when we get the Jews and the Gentiles to come to that understanding, then we will have unity at long last. But the next step, I think, on the hit parade will be the rapture of the church, in which case the focus will shift back to where it was before Jesus, to the Jews in the house of Jacob, and salvation will be of the Jews to the world. So the Jews will be replacing the church as the evangelists of the gospel of Jesus Christ during that final 70th week of Daniel, 7-year tribulation period. We went over a little bit tonight because there's so much stuff, Steve. You know, we haven't done a 2-hour teaching in a while. I mean, I'm sorry for those of you that have attention deficit disorder, but hopefully it was interesting enough to keep your attention here. And so we went a little long tonight, but you know, if you listen to it in 2 parts, the Lord isn't going to hate you for it. But if you want to get it all in before the rapture, maybe you better listen to it the first time you get a chance to. So with that, Steve, I said too much. We'll pick back up on Saturday to finish up what we're going through. And, we possibly could finish it. Might go into a 3rd week. But the prophecies of the book of Daniel, some of which were implicated here tonight, and the metallic man prophecy that we talked about on Saturday, we will continue to talk about when we get back down to South Beach on Saturday. And so for those of you that a little homework ahead, read Daniel chapter 2, 7, 8, and 9. And that's what we'll be talking about when we get down to South Beach on Saturday. So until then, Steve closes out the word of prayer, and we'll see you guys again Saturday morning down on South Beach on Ocean Drive.
Lord God, we thank you for another look at really, I guess, the Savior versus the adversary, Lord, and just what will be, what we're facing, what our choices are, Lord. I mean, it's a clear option that you've provided for us, Lord. I just pray that that even the Book of Esther might even show or describe the gospel for those who don't fully understand, although our Jewish brethren who have maybe overlooked it, Lord, or whose eyes have just been sort of blinded for now, Lord. Pray that maybe even through the Book of Esther the gospel could be revealed. And Lord, as Herb mentioned, I guess that the whole of the book is about you. And Lord, we thank you for the opportunity for us to be able to study, because not one that we normally would have an opportunity to do, Lord, but we did today, and I thank you for the time that we had for it. And thank you most for your Son, Jesus Christ. In his name I pray. Amen.
All right. Close it out there.